Everyone else spent the evening trying to impress me. You were the only one honest enough not to try.
Grace, everyone is watching.
Then let them watch.
The ballroom smelled of melting beeswax, stale rosewater, and quiet desperation. They called her the ghost of Ainsley, invisible, forgettable. Until the most powerful man in the room walked past a dozen screaming beauties, stopped at her shadowed corner, and ruined her perfectly crafted isolation with a single blow. The heat inside the Wellington estate was a living, breathing thing. It pressed against the skin, thick with the cloying stench of 400 bodies sweating beneath layers of velvet, heavy silk, and desperation. Above, thousands of candles burned in crystal chandeliers, dripping hot wax onto the polished oak floors below. To anyone else, it was the pinnacle of the summer season. To Margot, it was a beautifully decorated slaughterhouse. Margot leaned her shoulder against the cool plaster of a structural pillar, retreating as far into the shadows of the alcove as the architecture allowed. She was 24, technically a duchess, and entirely invisible. The title of Ainsley was a hollow shell, left to her by a late husband whose enthusiasm for gin and faro had vastly outweighed his constitution. When a fever took him 3 years ago, he left her with a crumbling estate, a mountain of debts, and a title that acted as a social repellent. In this world, a duchess without a fortune was a tragedy. A young, impoverished widow was a cautionary tale. So, they ignored her, and Margot, cynical and utterly exhausted by the pantomime of high society, welcomed the erasure. Her dress was 5 years old. She had dyed it midnight blue in an iron pot in her own kitchens to hide the fading, but under the aggressive glare of the chandeliers, the original plum thread glinted traitorously at the seams. A sharp piece of whalebone in her corset had snapped an hour ago and was currently digging a slow, rhythmic groove into her left rib with every breath. She wanted a glass of water. Her throat felt lined with chalk, dry from the ambient haze of cigar smoke drifting from the adjoining card room. But the footman, carrying silver trays of champagne and lemonade, glided past her alcove without a second glance. Why serve the ghost when the living were thirsty? A shrill laugh shattered her thoughts. A few feet away, Diana of House Linfield was holding court. Diana smelled overwhelmingly of synthetic jasmine and ambition. Her pale pink gown was an architectural marvel of lace and exposed cleavage, designed to draw the eye and trap it. Beside her, Cecily murmured agreement to whatever vicious gossip Diana was spinning. "They say he arrived by carriage straight from the continent," Diana whispered loudly, snapping her silk fan open with a sound like a cracking whip. "Unmarried, and holding the entire Kensey fortune." The man could buy the crown if he wished. Margot pressed a gloved finger against her temple, feeling the dull throb of a migraine taking root. The Duke of Kensey, Rowan. He was the reason the room hummed with a frantic, feral energy tonight. The marriage mart had been stagnant for weeks, and a wealthy, eligible duke was blood in the water. Then, the heavy mahogany double doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open. The low roar of conversation didn't stop, but its pitch changed. It dropped into a collective, breathless murmur. Margot didn't need to look to know he had arrived. The desperate shift in the room's center of gravity gave it away. Rowan, the Duke of Kensey, did not stride into the room like a romantic hero in a penny dreadful. He walked in like a man walking to the gallows. He was tall, yes, and his tailoring was immaculate stark black broadcloth that absorbed the candlelight rather than reflecting it. But he looked deeply, fundamentally irritated. Margot watched him from the safety of her pillar. He wasn't conventionally flawless. His jaw was a hard, unforgiving line, and there was a slight bend to his nose, as if it had been broken and set poorly years ago. His dark hair was brushed back, but a few strands stubbornly defied pomade. What struck Margot wasn't his power or his wealth, but the way he rubbed his thumb aggressively against the side of his index finger, a subtle, frantic tick. He hates this, Margot realized. The thought offered a brief, dark flare of amusement. Immediately, the social vultures descended. Lord Wellington intercepted him first, loudly clapping him on the shoulder. Then came the introductions. The mothers pushed their daughters forward with the subtlety of military generals deploying infantry. Diana positioned herself directly in his path, laughing at a joke no one had made, her chest heaving as she dropped into a curtsy so deep she nearly lost her balance. Rowan's expression remained entirely blank. He nodded. He offered perfunctory bows, but his eyes, dark, flat, and exhausted, scanned the room over Diana's head. He was looking for an exit. Margot felt the sharp whalebone bite deeper into her rib as she shifted her weight. Her left heel burned where a blister had formed against the stiff leather of her worn dancing slippers. The air was growing thinner, heavy with the scent of roasted meats from the dining hall and the overwhelming floral perfumes of 100 desperate women. The noise, the scraping of the orchestra's cellos, the clinking of crystal, the high-pitched giggles, was drilling into her skull. She couldn't stay in this room for another hour. It didn't matter if leaving early was a breach of etiquette. No one was watching her anyway. Keeping her back close to the wall, Margot slipped out of the alcove. She moved with the quiet, practiced grace of someone who had spent 3 years learning how not to take up space. She slid past a group of elderly dowagers arguing over whist, dodged a drunken viscount swaying near the punch bowl, and slipped through the heavy velvet curtains that led to the estate's conservatory. The transition from the ballroom to the conservatory was a physical shock. The air here was 10 degrees cooler, heavy not with sweat and perfume, but with the raw, earthy scent of wet soil, crushed leaves, and blooming citrus. The high glass ceiling caught the moonlight, casting pale, geometric shadows across the gravel paths. Margot let the heavy velvet curtain fall closed behind her, cutting off the noise of the orchestra as if she had plunged her head under water. She exhaled a long, shuddering breath. The silence was magnificent. She walked down a narrow path, flanked by monstrous ferns and towering orange trees planted in massive terracotta urns. Finding a secluded stone bench obscured by the broad, waxy leaves of a monstrous monstera plant, she sat heavily. Instantly, she abandoned propriety. With a wince, she reached down and unlaced her left slipper, pulling it off her foot. The blister on her heel was raw, weeping slightly against her stocking. She groaned, rubbing the sore arch of her foot, then reached up to her bodice. She pressed her hand hard against her left side, trying to bend the broken piece of corset bone away from her bruised skin. If you snap it completely, it will only stab you deeper. Margot froze. Her hand remained plastered to her ribs, her stockinged foot hovering above the cold gravel. A shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness near the glass wall. Rowan stepped into the pale moonlight falling through the ceiling. He had stripped off his gloves, holding them crumpled in one fist. He looked even larger in the enclosed space of the conservatory, his broad shoulders seeming to take up all the breathable air. He didn't look scandalized by her half-dressed state. He looked incredibly tired. Margot didn't gasp. She didn't blush. A cold, cynical irritation spiked in her chest. She slowly lowered her hand from her bodice and planted her bare foot flat on the cold gravel, refusing to scramble for her shoe like a frightened child. "I was under the impression," Margot said, her voice dry and gravelly from disuse, "that the Duke of Kensey was currently being devoured alive by Lady Diana in the main hall." Rowan let out a harsh, brief exhalation that might have been a laugh. He walked closer, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel, and stopped a few feet away, leaning his back against a wrought iron trellis. "Lady Diana stepped on the hem of her own gown and tore it," he said flatly. "While she was mourning the loss of the lace, I retreated." He tilted his head, studying her in the dim light. "You left before the ambush even began." "I have no interest in ambushes," Margot said, She picked up her slipper, weighing it in her hand. She felt exposed, not because of her foot, but because of the sharp, dissecting quality of his stare. People usually looked through her. Rowan was looking at times her. Nor do I have the stamina to pretend your arrival is the most thrilling event of the decade. Your Grace. Rowan's jaw twitched. He looked down at the terracotta pot next to him. He reached out, running a bare finger over the rim. It came away smeared with damp, black earth. Most women in that room would have tripped over themselves to agree with whatever I said just now, he murmured, rubbing the dirt between his thumb and index finger, that same nervous tick she had noticed earlier. Most women in that room have dowries and reputations to protect, Margot countered. I have neither. I am a widow, heavily in debt, wearing a dress that is older than the wine being served tonight. I have nothing to gain by lying to you, and nothing to lose by insulting you. Rowan stopped rubbing his fingers together. He turned his head slowly, fully facing her. The moonlight caught the rough break of his nose, the deep shadows under his eyes. You're the Ainsley widow, he stated. It wasn't a question. Margot, she corrected automatically, before she could stop herself. Margot. He tested the name. It felt strange hearing it aloud. Society called her the Dowager, or poor Ainsley's mistake, or simply her. Hearing her actual name in a deep, gravelly baritone made her stomach tighten in a way she deeply resented. He pushed off the trellis and took a step closer, stopping just at the edge of the bench. The heavy, stifling smell of the ballroom was gone, replaced by the faint scent of sandalwood, starch, and something sharp and metallic, like cold air before a storm, rolling off his coat. You're hiding, he said, gesturing to her bare foot. I am resting, she corrected sharply, and tending to a wound inflicted by cheap leather. You, Your Grace, are hiding. I am preserving my sanity, Rowan countered, a sudden dark intensity flaring in his eyes. He leaned down slightly, closing the distance between them. Do you have any idea what it is like in there? It's a meat market. They look at me, and they don't see a man. They see a ledger. They see titles, estates, unentailed funds. Margot let out a bitter, humorless laugh. She looked up at him, her neck straining slightly. Oh, the sheer horror of being valued for your immense wealth and power. My deepest sympathies, Your Grace. It must be agonizing to have doors held open for you, to have every word you speak treated as gospel, to have a dozen beautiful women begging for your attention. Rowan's eyes narrowed. It is entirely hollow. Hollow is better than invisible, Margot snapped, the raw truth bleeding out before she could bite it back. Her grip on her shoe tightened until her knuckles turned white. You complain that they see your ledger instead of your soul. Do you know what they see when they look at me? Nothing. I am a cautionary tale, a stain on the upholstery. I sit in corners and watch people who used to drink my husband's wine pretend I do not exist because my existence reminds them of failure. She stopped, her chest heaving, the broken corset bone biting viciously into her flesh. She closed her eyes, instantly regretting her outburst. She sounded bitter. She sounded pathetic. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, broken only by the faint, rhythmic drip of condensation falling from the glass roof onto the broad leaves of the ferns. Margot waited for him to offer a platitude. You exaggerate. You are still young. Things will improve. The hollow comforts of a society that didn't care. Instead, Rowan spoke, his voice incredibly quiet. Put your shoe back on, Margot. She opened her eyes, startled. He was looking down at her foot, then back to her face. There was no pity in his expression, only a hard, grounded reality. The supper bell is going to ring in 10 minutes, Rowan said, stepping back to give her space. He pulled his crumpled gloves through his hands, straightening the leather. And when it does, the doors will open, and they will pour out here to find me. If you are sitting here with your shoe off, complaining about being invisible, they will tear you apart for being alone with me. Margot's jaw tightened. She hated that he was right. She shoved her foot roughly back into the stiff leather shoe, biting the inside of her cheek to mask the flare of pain from the blister. She stood up, brushing invisible dust from her dyed skirt. She refused to look at him as she adjusted her posture, locking away the raw, angry woman and replacing her with the ghost of Ainsley. "Thank you for the warning, Your Grace," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. She turned to leave, aiming for the heavy velvet curtains that would plunge her back into the suffocating noise of the ballroom. "Margot," Rowan called out. She paused, looking over her shoulder. He was watching her, the moonlight carving deep, uncompromising lines into his face. The frantic tick in his fingers was gone. He looked entirely still. "For what it's worth," he said, his voice carrying easily over the damp earth and blooming orange trees. "I saw you before Diana tore her dress, before I left the hall. And you was standing by the pillar, looking like you wanted to set the room on fire." Margot's breath hitched, just slightly. A tiny, imperceptible snag in her carefully constructed armor. "And for what it's worth," Rowan finished, turning away to face the glass wall. "I thought it was the most honest thing in the entire room." Margot didn't reply. She couldn't. She turned forward, pushed through the velvet curtains, and let the crushing heat and noise of the ballroom swallow her whole. But as she slipped back into the shadows of her alcove, the air around her felt different. It felt charged, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel invisible. The supper bell did not chime. It clattered. It was a heavy, brassy sound that cut through the strings of the orchestra and sent a physical ripple through the ballroom. Immediately, the frantic migration began. Margot let the tide of silk and broadcloth carry her forward, keeping her head down. The dining hall of the Wellington estate was a cavernous room, designed entirely for intimidation. 2 massive fireplaces roared at either end, throwing out a dry, oppressive heat that clashed violently with the damp draft leaking from the tall, poorly sealed windows. The air was thick with competing smells: roasted venison dripping in heavy red wine sauce, the sharp tang of bruised mint, and the metallic, slightly sour scent of hundreds of silver forks scraping against porcelain. She aimed for the lowest table, positioned precariously near the swinging wooden doors of the kitchen. This was the purgatory of the dining hall, reserved for impoverished cousins, disgraced minor nobility, and invisible widows. Every time the doors swung open, a gust of hot, greasy air smelling of dishwater and boiled onions washed over the chairs. Margot took her seat. She didn't look toward the high table at the opposite end of the room. She didn't need to. The collective, predatory focus of 400 guests was anchored there. Lord Wellington had placed Rowan squarely in the center of the high table, flanked by Diana on his right and a terrifyingly ambitious Earl's daughter on his left. From her vantage point in the shadows, Margot watched a footman pour a dark, bruised plum wine into Rowan's glass. Rowan did not touch it. He was staring at his empty plate. He looked entirely cornered, his broad shoulders rigid against the high-backed velvet chair. Diana was leaning into his space, her mouth moving rapidly, her fan fluttering like a trapped moth. Margot looked down at her own setting. The silverware was slightly tarnished. A single bruised grape sat near the rim of her bread plate. She felt the dull, throbbing pain of the blister on her heel, a sharp reminder of the cold gravel and the startling, grounding weight of the Duke's voice in the dark. "I thought it was the most honest thing in the entire room." She squeezed her eyes shut. It was a mistake to remember it. Empathy was dangerous. It made the armor crack. A sudden, jarring noise snapped her eyes open. It was the screech of heavy wood dragging against marble. At the high table, Rowan stood. He didn't rise politely. He pushed his chair back with enough force that it tipped precariously before settling. The sound was deafening in a room built on polite, muffled murmurs. Conversation died. It didn't taper off. It was severed, as if a thick curtain had dropped over the room. Even the clinking of silverware stopped. Margot watched, her breath trapped painfully behind her ribs, as Rowan picked up his untouched wine glass. He stepped away from the high table. Lord Wellington half rose, his mouth opening in a silent, comical circle of confusion. Diana froze, her hand suspended midair. Rowan ignored them. He turned and began to walk down the length of the dining hall. His boots struck the marble floor with a slow, heavy rhythm. Crack, crack, crack. The sound echoed in the suffocating silence. He walked past tables of dukes and earls. He walked past the wealthy heiresses and the influential dowagers. He didn't look left or right. His gaze, dark and unreadable, was fixed entirely on the far end of the room. Margot's stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. No, she thought, panic flaring hot in her chest. Do not do this. Do not look at me. But he was already there. Rowan stopped at the rickety, drafty table by the kitchen doors. The guests, seated around Margot, a deaf vicar, and two terrified debutantes, shrank back into their chairs, looking as though a wolf had just wandered into the sheep pen. Rowan set his wine glass down next to Margot's tarnished fork. He pulled out the empty, uneven wooden chair beside her. He sat. He didn't announce his intentions. He didn't offer a charming, theatrical smile to the room. He simply reached for a silver platter of roasted root vegetables in the center of the table, spooned a modest portion onto his plate, and picked up his fork. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, the dining hall exploded. It wasn't a roar, but a furious, buzzing hiss. 400 people, whispering violently at once. It sounded like a hive of wasps, agitated by a stick. The physical weight of their collective stare hit Margot like a blow. She felt the heat rise to her cheeks, entirely against her will, as every eye in the room scrambled to identify the woman in the faded, midnight blue dress. Margot leaned closer to him, keeping her eyes fixed firmly on her empty plate. "Are you completely out of your mind?" she hissed, her voice barely audible over the drone of gossip. Rowan chewed a piece of roasted parsnip. He swallowed, his jaw working slowly. "The draft from the kitchen is quite refreshing," he murmured. "Up there, I was suffocating on the scent of spoiled roses in desperation. You have just painted a target on my back," Margot said, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. She clenched them into tight fists to stop the shaking. "They ignored me because I was nothing. Now they are going to tear me apart to find out why you are sitting here." Rowan turned his head. He looked at her, entirely unbothered by the hundreds of daggers being stared into his back. The erratic tick in his fingers was gone. He looked grounded. He looked calm. "Let them try," he said softly. The dinner dragged on, an agonizing exercise in endurance. Course after course arrived. The footman, clearly terrified by the breach in protocol, practically threw the plates onto their table and scurried away. Margot ate nothing. Her throat was tight, her chest aching, where the broken corset bone dug into her ribs with every shallow breath. The whispers never ceased. She could feel Diana's glare burning a hole through the back of her neck from the high table. She felt naked, stripped of the protective invisibility she had cultivated for 3 years. "You aren't eating," Rowan observed quietly. He was systematically cutting a piece of roasted duck. "I have lost my appetite," Margot replied, staring at the grain of the wood on the table. "Eat the bread, Margot. You look as though you are about to faint, and if you collapse, Wellington will insist on carrying you out, which will only prolong this circus." His tone wasn't gentle. It was pragmatic, flat, and entirely devoid of pity. It was exactly what she needed. The cynical, demanding instruction anchored her, cutting through the rising panic. She reached out, her fingers clumsy, and tore a small piece from the crusty roll on her plate. She forced herself to chew. It tasted like ash, but she swallowed it down. "Better?" he asked, not looking up from his plate. "Marginally," She took a sip of her water, the rim of the glass cool against her dry lips. "Why? Did you really do this?" Rowan set his knife down. He leaned back in the rickety chair, the wood groaning in protest under his weight. He looked out over the room, watching the sea of faces that were pretending not to watch them back. "I spent 2 years on the continent," Rowan said, his voice dropping low, intended only for her, most of it in the mud, negotiating borders that men in warm rooms drew on maps. "I watched good men die over lines of ink. When my brother died and the title fell to me, I came back to this." He gestured vaguely to the opulent, overstuffed room. "They look at me, and they see a prize pig at a country fair. They don't care if I am broken. They don't care if I can barely sleep through the night without waking up smelling gunpowder." Margot turned her head, looking at him fully for the first time since he sat down. The shadows under his eyes looked darker in the flickering candlelight of the dining hall. The harsh lines of his face weren't born of arrogance. They were born of exhaustion. "I sat at that table," Rowan continued, his jaw tightening, "and Lady Diana asked me which of my estates had the best lighting for a summer ball. And I realized that if I stayed in that chair for one more minute, I was going to violently dismantle the table." He finally turned to look at her. His eyes were dark, searching, and painfully unguarded. "I didn't sit here to save you, Margot," he said quietly. "I sat here because you are the only person in this room who knows how to survive in the dark. I needed to sit next to someone real." Margot's breath hitched. The broken bone in her corset bit into her side, a sharp, grounding pain. The blister on her heel throbbed. The faded threads of her dyed dress chafed against her skin. She was flawed, impoverished, and entirely ruined in the eyes of the society that surrounded them. But as she looked at Rowan, she saw the same jagged edges. He was a man drowning in his own power, suffocated by a world that demanded a performance he no longer had the energy to give. She didn't offer him a sweet smile. She didn't bat her eyelashes or offer a demure, comforting platitude. Instead, Margot reached for the heavy silver pitcher of water, sitting between them. She poured a generous measure into his untouched wine glass, diluting the heavy, bruised plum liquid until it was a pale, washed-out pink. She set the pitcher down with a dull thud. "The wine here is terrible anyway," she said, her voice dry, steady, and devoid of fear. "It tastes like vinegar and regret." Rowan stared at the diluted wine. Then, slowly, the hard, unforgiving line of his mouth broke. He smiled. It wasn't a handsome, practiced smirk. It was a raw, genuine expression of relief that reached his eyes and softened the jagged angles of his face. He picked up the glass, raising it slightly toward her in a silent toast. "To vinegar and regret," he murmured. He drank. Around them, the room continued to buzz with furious, venomous whispers. The heat pressed in, the smell of roasting meats and dying flowers thick in the air. The orchestra in the adjoining room struck up a new, lively waltz, completely at odds with the tension in the dining hall. But Margot no longer felt the oppressive weight of their stares. She sat perfectly straight in her rickety chair, her worn slippers planted firmly on the drafty floor. She did not shrink. She did not hide. She sat beside the most powerful man in England, and for the first time in her life, she let them look. If you felt the raw, quiet power of Margot and Rowan's defiance, do not let this story fade into the background. Hit the like button to show your support for heroines who survive in the shadows. Share this video with someone who appreciates a romance built on gritty, unspoken truths rather than empty fairy tales. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss our next descent into historical drama. Your support keeps these stories alive.